I was greatly encouraged by Eric's story about the 4-hour Royals game. I mean, if you can sit that long, I think we could go till 3 today. I think I'd work out. But I'll try to be briefer than that. I love the idea of those 3 hours worth of baptisms that's in the bulletin. 6 to 9 baptisms. You know, that means if you do one a minute, that's 180 people being baptized. But I don't think that's what it meant, is it? I'm sorry. I'm just picturing 3 hours of baptisms in a kiddie pool. I think you'd have to change the water at some point. That's all I'm saying. So, and I appreciated Dustin's report. Just last Sunday, I saw for the first time in quite a while a young lady and her husband who've been in the Yunnan province of China. And they've been there for 5 years as missionaries. And it's exciting for me because when she was a young child, when she was at our church, she grew up in our church in Overland Park, and I was the one that got to baptize her. So now she's a missionary with her husband, and that also means that any work that they do, I also get credit for. I mean, it's like sort of like Amway or something like that. I just get so the more that I baptize, so got to keep track of these things. That's important. And also, I don't know how Justin knew that I had a silk tie made in China. When you said that, I go, oh, yeah, Shizing. Okay. We are not defined by our appearance, by appearances. What I want to talk about today is the difference between the Old Testament and the New Testament. The difference between what is more physical and what is more spiritual. For example, there's a statement by Paul that the law was a shadow, but reality belongs to Christ. That's a shadow. A shadow, by the way, is real, but it's not as real as what is solid. There are levels of reality. And by the way, this life that we're in, it's real, but it's not as real as the life we're going to live. There's some things that are going to change. It's dramatic. But that's kind of the change from the old to the new. Paul said in one place, actually 2 Corinthians 5, I used to judge Christ by appearances, but now I don't anymore. Because under the old law, appearance was everything. Another place, Paul says, we have a circumcision not made with hands. And we are Jews inwardly, not outwardly. He makes that distinction of being God's people. And in the Old Testament, there's the law, do not kill. That's a very physical thing. In the New Testament, what does Jesus say? Do not get angry. Because if you don't get angry, you won't be killing. And he's talking about an inner law, a spiritual law. If you can apply and follow the spiritual law, then this physical law will follow. And another thing he said is do not commit adultery, physical law. But Jesus said, do not lust. If you follow that spiritual inward law, then the other one will follow. People get worried if I talk about how the Old Testament has passed away, and I'll go more into that. But they get worried because, well, what about the 10 Commandments? What about the 10 Commandments? 9 of them are repeated in the words of Jesus, but in a spiritual way. There's only one that's not repeated, and we'll talk about that too for a reason. But the thing is, some people, when they read the Old Testament, and this is important for reaching out people in our culture, they read the Old Testament and they get concerned about God. They said, I don't like that God. I'm afraid of that God. He seems like a vengeful, mean God. And I understand that, don't you? When you read the Old Testament, there's some things in there hard to explain from the view beyond the cross. On this side of the cross, it doesn't seem like the God we know. God did not change, but our relationship to God changed. God did not change, but our theology changed. And theology is a word meaning how I get to know God, how I know who God is, how I study God. So it has to do with my perception of God. And because of Christ, because of the coming of Christ, the perception of God is totally different from the God of the Old Testament. Same God, but he has been revealed more. And what does it say in the New Testament? That there will come a time when Jesus will appear again. You know, it's interesting, it doesn't really talk about a second coming so much as a second appearance of Christ. And we have seen him once, not personally, but we see him through the words of the New Testament. We have seen who Jesus was, but we are going to see him in a totally different way, aren't we? One day. In fact, that's the promise that I give to people at the graveside. When I'm having a graveside service, I say, it's not over, and you will know this person again. And how you will know them is not by physical, but by spiritual. Right now, we have a physical body that dominates and a spiritual being that's kind of within us. Then we will still have a body, but it will be a heavenly body, Paul says. We'll have a spiritual body. It's just flipped. Everything is different. Guess what? I didn't say a word about that at first service. It just got me going. Okay, so appearances. So please, could you call some of the people from first to come back? Because I hate for them to miss this good part. So let me use myself as an example of how physical doesn't really determine us. This is actually a picture of me, October 27, 2017. I woke up on that morning and my face had fallen on this side. It's a paralysis, and I couldn't do anything but frown on this side. My eye would not close. It would just stay open all the time, and other things happen. People see it and they say, oh, my uncle had Bell's palsy, lasted 5 weeks. And I have to tell everybody all the time, it's not Bell's palsy. Bell's palsy does last only a few weeks. I'm still continuing to deal with this. It's called Ramsay-Hunt syndrome. And I am 1 in 100,000 people to get it. It's that rare. It is so rare, I don't know how many doctors I've talked to, ophthalmologists, audiologists, doctors, ENT, who never heard of it. Doctors who never heard of Ramsay-Hunt syndrome. And it's important to know the difference because treatment ends up being different. If you're delayed in your treatment with Ramsay-Hunt, you have more serious complications afterwards. So I get a little impatient with it's Bell's palsy. It's not. But I still am who I am. I still was the same person after this happened. When I woke up and saw it in the mirror, I tell you what, the first thing I did, I saw it in the mirror and I go, oh. My first thought was, I wonder if this is permanent. Because that's, I go, whoa, that's different. So immediately, I took a shower. I don't know why. I was just kind of overwhelmed, and so I took a shower. And then I called Vicki, and I said, I think I may be having a stroke or something. And she said, why have you not dialed 911 yet? I said, I forgot the number. So I called 911, and then they came, and I didn't get to tell this story. I'm getting all messed up here. The police came first, and then the ambulance, that sort of thing. And when they came in the door, I was sitting at the top step. We have a split level, just sitting there. And the policewoman says, are you the one who called 911? I said, yes, I am, as best I could. She goes, you seem very calm. I took that as a compliment, but I am calm because there's something we have that is bigger than the physical. I know that's what was working in me. I can't take credit for it, but it was different. So I made jokes all the way to the hospital, too. It was very fun thing. Very interesting thing. The great thing, I got to ride in an ambulance for my first time in my life. That was exciting to do that. And also, if you have Ramsay-Hunt, the first thing the doctor asked me in the ER, he says, raise your eyebrows. I can only raise one eyebrow. This one is frozen. I can only raise one. So if something happens, I'll never look surprised. I'll just look curious. Oh, really? Dan, your car's on fire. Oh my. So I can't do it. So we're not defined physically. And on a more normal sense, that's extreme, but I'm not defined by how much money I have. I'm not defined by what kind of house I have. I'm not defined by how many people I know. I'm not defined by how many friends I have on Facebook, God forbid. That doesn't define us at all. What defines us is what's inner. And that's a basic difference between the old and the new. The old, in fact, was a set of rules. Do you know how many rules are in the Old Testament? Ask any rabbi. They always know. 613. That's a number they know. There are 613 rules in the Old Testament, and that's not including the rules in the Talmud. In the Old Testament, there's a line that says, do not boil a kid. It's talking about the child of a goat. Not a child. It's talking about a goat. But do not boil a goat in its mother's milk. And because of that verse, according to the Talmud, which is a commentary on the Bible, Orthodox Jews have 2 sets of dishes. That's the connection. And you go, whoa, because it's a rule-keeping approach, and they just took the rules and even expanded them like that. So the question comes, what did the Jews have back in the time of Christ? What did they have that was so precious? And we're going to be talking about that. We're going to go into detail on that. But I want to read in your bulletin the last 4 verses here, actually 5. It said, see to it that you do not refuse him who speaks, Hebrews 12. If they did not escape when they refused him who warned them on earth, how much less will we if we turn away from him who warns us from heaven? At that time his voice shook the earth, but now he has promised, once more I will shake not only the earth but also the heavens. The words once more indicate the removing of what can be shaken. That is, created things, so that what cannot be shaken may remain. That's the invisible things. Therefore, since we are receiving a kingdom that cannot be shaken, let us be thankful and so worship God acceptably with reverence and awe, for our God is a consuming fire. What he was predicting there, and it's basic to what I want to say today, was the destruction of Jerusalem. That's what he's talking about throughout Hebrews. Whenever he quotes a prophet like Habakkuk or Haggai, the prophecy is a prophecy about the destruction of Jerusalem back in the 6th century BC. And those prophecies he's applying because this letter was written just before the destruction. So in the 1st century, you have these Jewish Christians that are getting afraid. So this slide says, because of all these things that are happening in the 1st century, many of the early Christians were wanting to return to Judaism once the persecution of the Christians began. Do we have that slide that says that? It's the next one, I think. There it is. There were so many Christians that were seeing persecution of Christians again. A beginning of persecution. You know what happened in the 1st century? They thought that Christianity was a sect of Judaism. So the Romans were not worried about it. The Romans had a law, no new religions. But the Jewish religion predated the Roman law, so they said, you're okay. They grandfathered them in. So even Jews did not have to, Jews in the army did not have to work on the Sabbath. They had some special privileges. So they were extending that to Christians because they thought the Christians were also part of Judaism, because at the very beginning, all Christians were Jews. Jesus was Jewish. But then it changed, and the Jews made it clear to the Romans, these people are not part of us. In the book of Acts, you find a place where Gallo, the court judge, he says, these are disputes about your religion, go away. But the Jews didn't want it to be about religion. They wanted them separate. When they got that separation, then the persecution of Christians began. And because they were being persecuted, they wanted to go back to the old ways. They wanted to go back to Judaism. It was safer. And it had all these things too. Here's a house church where people are sitting around on little benches and talking with one another. Here's the temple. Here's the huge temple, and it's got all this gold and refinery. It's got this beautiful stuff, and it smells like incense. And one day there's sacrifices, and the blood is running. It's nauseating, the smell, but it's great. And they wanted to go back to that. They wanted something they could hang on to. And this author is writing to those Christians and saying, don't go back. Partly saying, don't go back because it's about to end. AD 70, that Jerusalem was destroyed. And do you know how many sacrifices the Jews have offered since AD 70? 0. The old system was destroyed. Jesus said that would happen, not one stone upon another. So that was the end of that. That is why the book of Hebrews was written. And I have a picture of this guy writing the book of Hebrews. He said it's a letter of encouragement to remain faithful, loyal to your community. So here's how it compares. Here we have this list, the 10 things. Here are the 10 things that they held on to in Judaism. The prophets, the angels, Moses, the Sabbath, the priests, the promise, the Levites, the covenant, the sacrifices, the heroes. You can talk about these. And interestingly, this is an outline of the book of Hebrews. He takes their most precious things and said, Jesus is greater than the prophets. In fact, Hebrews chapter 1, verse 1 and 2 said, in the past, God spoke to our ancestors through the prophets at many times in various ways. But in these last days, he's not talking about the end of time. He's talking about the last days of Jerusalem. Look at the Old Testament when the phrase, the day of the Lord. That's what I want to say. By the way, this Ramsey hunt, it affects your memory. It also affects your hearing. I forgot to say that. I love Eric's singing, but music, I have post-herpetic neuralgia. My nerve in my ear is still damaged. So when things get real loud, and for some reason I sit close to the front, for some reason, I have to stick something in my ear. I forgot about it until just now. And every time I take that out, it's like I've invented stereo. Did you know that? It's great. This is good. But anyway, okay, so when you hear the day of the Lord in the Old Testament, it's the destruction. God is coming to visit the people, and the coming of Jesus will be the destruction as well. And he's warning them. So he's saying, what is he saying? Look at the outline of Hebrews. The word better, this Greek word better, kraton, it appears 19 times in the New Testament. 13 of those times it's in the book of Hebrews. It's the key word that he uses. Jesus is better than the angels. Jesus is better than the prophets. I mean, I read that passage. It says he used to speak through the prophets. Now he speaks through Jesus. What he's saying is the coming of Jesus, the appearance of Christ, made all the difference. The old is going. And what else did they have? They had Moses. Moses was great, but he's not as great as Jesus. Jesus offers us a better Sabbath. That's the one commandment that's not repeated in the new, because the Sabbath is totally different in the new. Jesus is a better priest. Jesus has a better promise. Jesus is better than the Levites. Why is he a better priest than the Levites? Because the Levites were descended from Abraham, because through the son of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Jacob's son was Levi. That's where the Levites come from. But Abraham paid tithes to Melchizedek. And it says very clearly, Jesus is a priest after the order of Melchizedek. And Melchizedek was superior to Abraham because Abraham paid tithes to him and was blessed by him. And the thing that's amazing when you read the Old Testament, it doesn't say much about Melchizedek. But what is amazing there is here's Abraham, the father of monotheism, the father of faith in the one true God, the beginning of three major religions that we still have today, Abraham, and he meets a guy who believes in the one true God out of nowhere. He wasn't Jewish. He was Melchizedek. He predated Abraham. So Jesus as a priest of that is better than the Levitical priest. Jesus offers us a better covenant. And that's one of the key things. You can't have how do I put it? In Hebrews, the word covenant is translated testament. And it talks about the last will and testament. And it talks about the Old Testament or covenant is about to end. And we're going to be under the New Testament. And when you write, okay, how many of you have kids? Those who have kids. You don't have to raise your hand. Many of you have kids. If you make a will, you have to determine what you're going to give to your kids. And there are some people that make a distinction, like my oldest son, Dennis. He is a very good person. He's done mission work. He teaches in a Bible school right now. He's very dedicated to Christ. He's my firstborn son. He should get a little more. I mean, that's the way it should be written. And then there's my son, Dan. Now, he was trouble from the word go. Don't know why we named him Dan. I was never any trouble, but he was trouble from the word go. Maybe we'll give him a little less. And then there's my daughter. My daughter is so special. My daughter is so special, she still lives at home. And she has a job, and she graduated from high school back in, I don't want to tell you. I won't. She'd kill me if I told you how to. But she's still there. So I guess I should give extra to her because she's put up with her parents for a long time. She actually takes care of us now. We're so old. No, she doesn't. But anyway, okay. But I could make a will distributing these things and then find out that my son Dennis, he's actually a murderer. Or something like that. And I thought, okay, yeah, I'm going to change my will. I'm not going to give money to a murderer. So I changed my will. Which one is valid? It's the second will. What does Hebrews say? That's the example he uses. He says the second will is valid. The old one has passed away. You can't have two testaments. We have in our Bible an Old Testament and a New Testament. It's become politically more correct to say Hebrew Bible and New Testament, because saying Old Testament is a little pejorative. Guess what? It's accurate. It's passed away. Like I said, some people want to hang on to those Old Testament rules. Do we really? Do we really want to have a rule relationship with God? Or do we want to have the more spiritual one? And that leads me to talk about Jesus a little more. Hebrews 12, 1-3. I think we've got it. Therefore, since we are surrounded by such a great cloud of witnesses, that's Hebrews 11. All those witnesses, let us throw off everything that hinders and the sin that so easily entangles. Let us run with perseverance the race marked out for us, fixing our eyes on Jesus, Not on Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Moses, Deborah, Samson, not on them, fixing our eyes on Jesus, the pioneer and perfecter of our faith. For the joy set before him, he endured the cross, scorning its shame, and sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. Consider him who endured such opposition from sinners, so that you will not grow weary and lose heart. They were suffering opposition, but they weren't being crucified. And I worry today, sometimes I hear Christians talk about our persecution of Christians today, persecutions in this country today. And you know what they give as an example? People don't want us to say Merry Christmas. You know, you can still say Merry Christmas and you won't be shot. Your head will not be cut off. But the persecution they're talking about is serious. Not being told you can't say Merry Christmas, it's not going to get you in any real trouble. Not yet. Now, someday there may be persecution, but I hesitate to honor Christians who say, oh, we're being persecuted. Got to say Merry Holidays or something like that. Oh, my goodness. I mean, it's not like persecution you'd have in China. You know what? In China, Xi Jinping, is that his name? Xi Jinping? Close enough. It's not Chinese, it's English. But anyway, they're shaking their heads. They can't get. But anyway, you know who you can't talk about in China? Who's the American hero that you cannot mention in China? Winnie the Pooh. Winnie the Pooh is banned in China. You can't mention it because people think Xi Jinping looks like Winnie the Pooh. And if you get, it's against the law. If you get caught, if you show up at the palace with a Winnie the Pooh doll, they'll take you to a place where you won't come back from. That's persecution, and that's just over Winnie the Pooh. That's not Jesus. But Christians identify, I think, more with Winnie the Pooh. Okay, so rest of chapter 12, 2 parts. In chapter 12, verses 4 through 17, there's the discipline part. And we need to understand discipline here is not talking about punishment. It's talking about discipline like being an athlete. And there's a discipline you have to follow. It's like a father teaching his son to ride a bike. That's God's discipline in us. Some people think, oh, I'm punished. This happened to me because God was upset with me. That was the last thought I've ever had. When I got the Ramsey hunt, I promise you, I never once thought, oh, God is punishing me for something. Now, if Vicky were in charge of the world, I would say maybe Vicky was doing this, but I wouldn't say that about God. Sorry, I get a big tickle out of it. Vicky is one of the kindest, sweetest people you know at church. They always say that, oh, she's so kind and sweet. And I say, they don't know. They haven't played cards with you, Vicky. I mean, it's a different Vicky that comes out. And then the rest of the chapter talks about Esau. And what it really says about Esau, it says he was godless. The word there really means secular or profane. And it gives the example of how he preferred the secular bowl of chili, or whatever that red porridge was or stuff was. He preferred that to his birthright. And so he said, okay, I'm going to die anyway if I don't get something to eat. You can have the birthright. He rejected the spiritual for the secular. And he's talking to these people that are in church, and they want to go back to they want to go back to something that wasn't church. They want to abandon the community. And then in the rest of chapter 12, the rest part of it, verses 18, 24, it talks about the two mountains. There's a mountain of joy and a mountain of fear. And he says, you have not come to a mountain that can be touched. And he goes on to say, it's burning fire. And if anybody touches it, they'll be put to death. I can picture teenagers back in the time of Moses prodding like a cow to get close enough to the mountain, just to see if it would zap them or something like that. You know, that would be so cool for a teenager. But it never mentions teenagers in Moses' time. I'm sorry, I got away again. But the other mountain cannot be touched. Look, verse 22. You have come to Mount Zion, to the city of the living God, the heavenly Jerusalem. You have come to thousands upon thousands of angels in joyful assembly. And what's the next thing? Picture that. Thousands and thousands of angels in joyful assembly to the church of the firstborn. Sometimes we depreciate the church too much. Sometimes we put it much lower than it ought to be. God loves the church. God wants us to be part of the church. Why? Because that's where we have community. That's where we define ourselves. We define ourselves by what we find in community. And how do we do that? How does that impact us? Look at this next slide. Ascending and descending. That's what spiritual formation and mission of Christ is. We ascend to God, and then we descend to the community. We come up to God in love because we love God first. And then we love one another. That's our community. Then we love our neighbor, and then we love our enemy. Paul says, the love of Christ compels me. Spiritual formation is when you turn to God in the community. Spiritual mission of Christ is when you descend then. You can see what it is. When I need to be filled again, I'm like Moses. I go back up to the mountain of God. Not literally. And I get filled back up. I come to worship with, I've heard this saying, I like to repeat it. We do not come here. We do not come to worship. We do not come together to worship. That's what it is. We do not come together to worship. We come to worship together. Worship is a daily task. It's a daily part of our lives. We just bring our worship together here because it's so valuable to be in community. Community is what we get from, we ascend to God through community. We descend through community to that outreach. We go out of our community to reach the single moms, like Eric talked about, and then we return to God. I'm gonna end on that slide, just talking about ascending and descending. And why do we need to ascend to God? We ascend to God because we need Him. And we descend because people need the Lord. We come to God because of our need. We descend with the love of God in our hearts to the people around us. And I hope Ty takes another sabbatical real soon because I've got a lot more to say about that. So, or maybe he'll just get sick. That'll be fine. I'll be able to come back. I love Ty so much. I didn't tell you this before. I met Ty when he was a youth minister in Los Angeles back in 1984. So we can say anything we want about each other. It's all good. It's all pleasant. God bless you this morning. Thank you so much for letting me be here. Thank you, Eric, for including me in your worship plan. I have a suggestion, though. The worship plan for both services, just the same. I think it would be great if for the second service you started at the end and worked back to the top. Reverse. Yeah? Then you could just still be singing that last song during the break, and then you start the service with it. Mathematically, it would be so balanced.